There was a time when the nights felt like they were made for them. Not in the way people say that when they're trying to make the past sound prettier than it was, but in the simple way it used to fit. A certain booth in a certain place, a certain song that always seemed to be playing when they walked in. The same waitress who pretended to be annoyed by them, but would still slide extra napkins across the table without being asked. The kind of routine that doesn't feel like a routine until it starts to slip. The bar didn't have a name that mattered. It was one of those spots with a sign outside and a warmth inside, the kind of place that looked better at night than it ever did in the day. The lights were dim enough to make everyone look like a softer version of themselves. The wood on the tables had been polished so many times it held a dull shine, like it had learned to reflect without trying. A low murmur always lived there, steady and constant, as if the room itself was breathing in and out. They would arrive in pairs or threes and fold into the booth like it was theirs, like it had been waiting. There were always small arguments about who sat where, always a joke about somebody taking up too much space, always a few moments where the conversation was just bodies settling and drinks being placed down. Then it would start. The rhythm of it. The back and forth that came naturally because it had been practiced without anyone realizing. Back then, he never questioned any of it. He didn't sit there and weigh the meaning of a Thursday night. He didn't listen for undertones. He didn't notice how often the same story came up. He was just there, and being there was enough. He was the kind of man who could blend, not because he was forgettable, but because he didn't make every room revolve around him. He laughed easily. He listened more than he spoke. He could throw a joke without turning it into a performance. When someone needed help moving furniture, he showed up. When someone needed a ride, he answered. He didn't think of himself as loyal. He just thought of himself as present. There were 4 of them most of the time, sometimes 5 when someone's cousin or coworker slid in for a week and then disappeared. The core stayed the same. Same faces, same voices, same small roles they played for each other without ever naming them. One of them was always late, the kind of late that wasn't an accident anymore. He'd arrive with an apology that sounded like a joke, and the group would react with the same fake outrage every time, like it was part of the script. Another one talked the most, always had a story, always had some new situation that involved a woman or a boss or a stranger who didn't know who they were dealing with. He would speak with his hands and lean forward, making the room smaller so it had to hold his energy. Then there was the closest one, the one who didn't need to talk as much because he didn't need to prove anything. He was quieter, sharper, and he had a way of looking at you that made you feel like he already understood what you were about. That was the one he'd known the longest. The one who had been there for birthdays, breakups, dumb fights, and long drives that ended in nothing but laughter and the smell of fast food in the car. It was easy to think it would always stay that way. Not because he was naive, but because nothing in their world pushed against it hard enough to make it change. Their lives were still shaped like each other. Their schedules matched. Their priorities were the same, even when they pretended they weren't. They could say they wanted more, they could talk about bigger plans, but their nights still ended at the same table, under the same lights, with the same jokes. The first shift didn't arrive like a crack in glass. It arrived like dust. So light at first he wouldn't have noticed it if it didn't build. He started waking up earlier, and at first it was nothing heroic. It wasn't some sudden transformation. It was just that he would open his eyes before the alarm and lie there in the dark, feeling the room still asleep around him. The air at that hour felt different, cleaner. The world was quiet in a way it never was at noon. He began to like that quiet, not because he was becoming some new man, but because it gave him a sense of space he didn't realize he'd been missing. He started going to the gym in the mornings, the kind of gym that always smelled faintly like rubber and disinfectant. At that hour, there weren't many people there. A few older men lifting carefully, a few young men with headphones in, eyes focused, moving like they had somewhere to be. Nobody talked much, nobody lingered. It felt like a place where effort mattered more than personality. He liked how simple it was. You walk in, you do the work, you leave. The reward wasn't applause. The reward was the quiet satisfaction of having done what you said you would do. He didn't tell the group about it in any dramatic way. It came up casually, like weather. Someone asked why he looked less tired lately, and he shrugged and said he'd been waking up earlier. They reacted with the right jokes, the ones they always used when someone did something different. Somebody called him old. Somebody asked if he was training for something. Somebody laughed and said, "Look at you getting your life together." It was light. It was nothing. He laughed too. But it wasn't nothing. Not because they were against it, but because it placed him one step out of sync. When you wake up early, nights feel different. When you spend your mornings in silence, loud rooms begin to sound louder. He didn't stop going out with them. He didn't vanish. He didn't preach. He just started leaving a little earlier. At first, it was small. He'd check his phone at the table and realize it was past midnight, and something in him would tighten slightly. Not fear, not guilt. Just a quiet awareness that tomorrow existed. He'd stand up and say he had to work in the morning, and the group would respond with the same half-mock disappointment. "Already?" someone would say, as if leaving before 2 in the morning was a personal betrayal. "You turning into one of those guys now?" another would ask, the tone playful enough to pass as a joke. He'd smile, nod, toss a few bills down, and walk out into the cool air. The street outside always smelled like exhaust and damp pavement. He would sit in his car for a moment before turning the key, listening to the quiet. Sometimes he'd look back at the glowing windows of the bar and feel a soft nostalgia already forming, even though he'd only just left. The change wasn't in the leaving. The change was in the feeling that came with it. It felt cleaner to go home than to stay. And that fact made him uneasy, like he was quietly admitting something he didn't want to admit. For a while it stayed there. A small shift. A minor difference in schedule. The group didn't care. The group didn't need to care. People change routines all the time. Then the second shift arrived, and this one didn't come from his calendar. It came from his ears. He started noticing the conversations. Not in the sense that he suddenly thought he was above them, but in the sense that he could hear the loop. He could hear the same complaints dressed in different outfits, the same arguments about bosses, about money, about women who didn't know what they wanted, the same jokes aimed at the same targets, the same little ego battles disguised as teasing. He had heard it all before, but before, it felt like bonding. Before, it felt like belonging. Now, it felt like running in place. He would sit at the table and laugh at the right moments, but there were gaps in the laughter, moments where he would smile without sound, like his body was going through the motions while his mind stood a few feet away. He didn't tell himself stories about it. He didn't sit there and think, "I'm outgrowing them." He didn't think, "I'm better." That wasn't how it felt. It felt more like waking up in a room you've been in your whole life and noticing the furniture is arranged in a way that makes it hard to breathe. Sometimes he'd look at his closest friend across the table and try to find the old ease, the old comfort. The friend would be laughing, leaning back, eyes half closed in that relaxed way that meant he felt at home. He'd catch his gaze and smirk, like they shared some silent understanding. And for a moment, everything would feel normal again. Then someone would say something, and the room would tilt. It was never one big thing. It was always a string of small things. A joke that wasn't funny but got repeated anyway. A comment about someone else's ambition delivered with just enough bitterness to be real. A story told for the 10th time, the punchline landing in the same place, as if repetition could keep it alive. He would feel something in his chest then, not anger, not disgust, just a quiet heaviness, like he was watching time slip through fingers that weren't even trying to hold it. He started coming later. That was when they noticed. At first they didn't say anything, because it's normal to be late once or twice, but it kept happening. He'd show up after they'd already ordered. He'd slide into the booth and greet them with the same warmth. But there was always a moment where someone would lean forward and say, "Look who decided to show." The jokes got sharper. Still playful, still wrapped in laughter, but sharper. "Bro out here acting busy now," someone said one night. "Don't worry, he'll come around," another replied, like he was a kid going through a phase. His closest friend would grin and shake his head, like it was all funny. But there was something in his eyes, something measuring. He brushed it off. He laughed. He didn't want to make it bigger than it was. But the truth was, he was becoming less available. Not because he was trying to hurt them, but because his days had begun to fill with things that didn't leave as much room for the old patterns. He started reading more. Not self-help slogans, just books that made him slow down. He started taking his work more seriously, not with stress, but with attention. He started cleaning his apartment in the mornings, not because he was obsessed, but because it felt good to exist in a space that reflected a kind of order. The more he did these small things, the more the old nights began to feel like a blur. The more he craved clarity, the more he noticed how foggy the hangouts were. And when you notice fog, you can't unnotice it. It wasn't that he stopped loving them. He still did. In quiet ways. In the way he'd look at them and remember who they used to be in high school, remember how they'd all been broke and hungry and convinced the world would bend for them. In the way he could still laugh at certain jokes because they carried memories. In the way he still felt protective, still felt a responsibility that wasn't spoken. But love doesn't stop time. Love doesn't keep people aligned when they begin to want different things from life. His closest friend started testing him. It began subtly. A text late at night. "Where you at?" A call at noon on a Saturday. "We going out tonight?" No question mark, just assumption. At first he would say yes, he would show up. He didn't want to be the guy who disappeared. Then he started saying no sometimes. Not dramatic no, not angry no, just no. "Can't tonight," he'd text. "Got an early morning." The first time he did it, there was a pause. Then a reply. "Since when you got early mornings?" with a laughing emoji that didn't fully feel like laughter. He ignored it, or he told himself he did. A week later, another invite. "You coming?" the friend asked. "Probably not," he replied. "I'm tired." The response came quick. Tired from what? The joke was obvious, but underneath the joke there was a question, a real one. He didn't know how to answer without making it sound like an accusation. He didn't want to say, "Tired from watching the same night happen again." He didn't want to say, "Tired from pretending I still want this." He didn't want to say, "Tired from feeling like I'm losing time." So he sent another casual line and left it there. The friend didn't push, but the next time they saw each other, the friend leaned in with a grin and said, "Look at you, living like you got responsibilities." Everyone laughed. He laughed too, but the laugh felt like a coat that didn't fit. As months passed, the group began to treat his change like a joke they could keep alive. It became part of his identity in their eyes. He was the one trying to be better, the one on his grown man stuff, the one acting like he too good. They said it with smiles. They said it like they were proud. They said it like they weren't bothered. But he could feel something shifting under the surface. It showed up in small moments, in the way conversations would pause when he walked in, like they had to adjust their tone, in the way his closest friend would sometimes look at him longer than necessary, like he was trying to recognize him, in the way invitations started to come with comments attached. "You can bring your bedtime with you," someone said once. "Don't worry, we'll keep it quiet for you," another said, and the table laughed. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach all the way. He didn't become cold. He didn't become rude. He didn't start lecturing. He just started listening more carefully. One night they sat at the table and the talk drifted toward dreams the way it always did, toward the things they said they would do one day. Someone talked about starting a business, the way people do when they want to sound ambitious without taking action. Another talked about moving to a new city, the way people talk about moving when they're really talking about escaping. His closest friend leaned back, arms crossed, and said, "Man, we've been saying that for years." The group laughed, but there was something bitter in it, like laughter that's trying to cover a bruise. Then someone looked at him and said, "You the one that's actually doing stuff. What you been on?" The question was innocent enough, but it made the table quiet in a way it hadn't been a moment before. He felt every eye on him. He could have listed things. He could have talked about the early mornings, the gym, the reading, the calm routines. He could have made it sound like a mission. He could have made himself the hero of a story. Instead, he shrugged. "Nothing crazy," he said. "Just trying to be better with my time." It was simple. It was honest. It was harmless. But the air changed anyway. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough. His closest friend smiled, but the smile was thin. "Better with your time," the friend repeated, like he was tasting the words. "So we a waste of time now?" Everyone laughed, because that's what you do when a joke comes close to the truth. You laugh to push it away. He laughed too, because it was easier than explaining how complicated it felt inside him. But when he drove home that night, the comment replayed in his head like a song you can't turn off. He was lying in bed later, the room dark, the silence heavy, and he stared at the ceiling thinking about the way people hear what they fear. He hadn't said they were a waste of time. He hadn't even thought it in those words, but they had heard it anyway, because it fit a story they were starting to build about him, a story where his growth was a judgment, a story where his change was an insult. The next week, he skipped the hangout entirely, not to prove a point, not to punish them. He just didn't want to go. The thought of that table made his chest feel tight. He told himself he'd go next time. Next time came and he didn't go again. The group text kept going without him. Jokes, memes, plans, somebody tagging him saying, "Where do you at, Mr. Early Morning?" The jokes were still there, still playful, still pretending. But the absence started to become a presence. He didn't know how to explain this part to anyone, even to himself. There was a strange loneliness in realizing you could love people and still feel lighter when you weren't around them. It made him feel guilty. It made him feel disloyal. It made him feel like he was betraying something sacred. Then again, there was a deeper part of him that felt relief. Not because he hated them, but because he could breathe. His days started to feel fuller, not busier, just fuller, like he was actually living them instead of escaping them. He would wake early and sit with coffee in his hands, listening to the quiet hum of the city waking up. He would watch the sky lighten at the edges of buildings. He would feel something settle in him, a calm that didn't depend on anybody else's laughter, a steadiness he hadn't known he was craving. Sometimes he would scroll through old photos of them, and the affection would hit him like a wave. Smiling faces, arms around shoulders, the proof that it had been real, that it had mattered, that it still did. He wasn't trying to erase them. He wasn't trying to rewrite history. He was just moving forward in a way that didn't leave room for the old rhythm. When he did show up again, after a couple weeks, it felt like walking into a room you used to live in after you've moved out. Everything is familiar, but your body doesn't relax the same way. They greeted him loudly, like they wanted to prove there was no tension. "Look who's alive," someone said. "Bro finally decided to bless us," another replied. His closest friend stood and hugged him hard, a little too hard, like the hug was trying to communicate something words weren't. They sat down. Drinks arrived. The jokes flowed. But he felt it. The thin layer over the surface, the unspoken question sitting at the bottom of the table like a weight. Why are you different? He tried to be present. He really did. He leaned in. He laughed. He listened. He told himself to stop overthinking. Then he noticed the way his closest friend kept glancing at him when he spoke, as if looking for signs, signs of judgment, signs of superiority, signs that he was leaving. He didn't know how to reassure him without making it worse. He didn't know how to say, "I still love you, but I can't be who I was without betraying who I'm becoming." That kind of sentence doesn't land well in a bar. It sounds like a speech. And he didn't want to give speeches. He wanted to be quiet about his change. He wanted it to be natural, not announced. As the night went on, he stepped away to take a call. The bar was crowded and loud, and he walked toward the hallway where the music softened. The walls were painted a dark color that made everything look deeper. He stood near the edge of the hallway and held his phone loosely in his hand, not even dialing. He just needed air. He could still hear their voices from the booth, blurred by laughter. Then he heard his name. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't said dramatically. It was said in that casual way people speak when they forget someone is close enough to hear. His closest friend's voice came through first. "He'd been acting different," the friend said, like he was stating a fact, like he was describing the weather. Another voice replied, a small laugh. "Different how?" There was a pause, not long, just long enough to hold truth. "Like, he thinks he better than us now," the friend said. The sentence landed in him in a strange way. Not like a punch, not like an insult, but like a door closing softly. He stood still, the phone in his hand feeling suddenly heavy. Someone else laughed. "Nah, for real," the friend continued. "He don't even be around like that. He be on that whole time is precious, I'm doing stuff type of energy. Like we just here wasting days." A third voice, quieter, said, "Maybe he is just busy." The friend scoffed, and the scoff carried something painful in it. "He not busy," the friend said. "He just changed." He felt his throat tighten, not because he was angry, not because he was shocked. It was more complicated than that. He felt a sadness so quiet it almost passed as calm. A sadness mixed with understanding, because part of him knew why the friend would see it that way. When someone you love changes, it forces you to look at yourself. It forces you to ask questions you don't want to ask. It can be easier to call it arrogance than to call it growth. It can be easier to call it betrayal than to call it distance. He didn't step into the room. He didn't confront them. He didn't make a scene. He just stood there, letting the words settle into his bones. After a moment, he walked back to the booth with a smile on his face that felt like a mask. He sat down and joined the conversation as if he hadn't heard anything. His closest friend clapped him on the shoulder and joked about him disappearing. The group laughed. He laughed with them. But something had shifted, and it wasn't something that could be undone with a joke. He stayed for another hour, maybe 2. He drank slowly. He listened. He nodded at the right times. He smiled when his closest friend spoke, and his closest friend smiled back as if nothing was wrong. Inside him, a quiet decision began to form. Not a decision to hate them, not a decision to cut them off dramatically, just a decision to stop begging to be understood. When he left that night, he hugged them all. His closest friend held him a beat too long, and in that hug he could feel the friend trying to hold on to the old version of him, as if strength in arms could stop time. He drove home with the radio off. The city lights passed like distant stars. He watched them through the windshield, as if he was watching another life. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was full of thought. He thought about how strange it was that he had never once looked at his friend and thought, "You're holding me back." He hadn't framed it that way. He hadn't blamed them. He had just begun to move differently, and they had interpreted his movement as judgment. He thought about his own fear, too, because part of him had been afraid to change fully. Part of him had been dragging the old nights along like a comfort blanket, telling himself he could be both men at once, the man who rises early and the man who stays late, the man who wants peace and the man who wants belonging. He realized he couldn't. Not forever. In the weeks that followed, he became quieter in the group chat. He still responded sometimes. He still sent a joke here and there. He didn't want them to think he hated them. He didn't want to become a ghost. But he stopped forcing himself to show up. When invites came, he declined without long explanations. "Can't tonight," he'd say. "What you doing?" someone would ask. "Just chillin'," he'd reply and leave it there. At first they kept pushing. "Come on, bro. Stop acting like you too good. We ain't gonna be here forever." Then the pushing faded into fewer messages. The jokes thinned out. His closest friend reached out separately sometimes, a call, a quick text. "You good?" the friend asked. He would say yes, because he was good. He was better than good in some ways. He felt calmer, he felt clearer, but he also felt something like grief, and he didn't know how to describe grief to a man who thought change was an insult. They met up once, just the two of them, for coffee in the afternoon. It felt different without the group. The friend looked tired, like he had been sleeping poorly. He kept making jokes, but the jokes didn't land the same. There was too much unsaid between them. They talked about surface things, work, sports, people they knew. Then the friend leaned back and looked at him with a kind of guarded curiosity. "So what you on these days?" the friend asked, and the question carried more weight than the words. He could have said a lot. He could have told him about the mornings, about the peace, about the way discipline felt like freedom. He could have told him how he had heard what was said that night, how it had hurt, how it had clarified things. Instead, he looked at his friend and saw the man he had loved for years, the man who had been beside him through things he didn't even talk about. He saw the fear under the jokes. He chose softness. "I'm just trying to be steady," he said. "That's all." The friend stared at him for a moment, like the words didn't satisfy whatever hunger was behind the question. Then the friend smiled, but it wasn't the old smile. "Steady," the friend repeated. "Must be nice." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just nodded. They sat there for a while longer, two men drinking coffee in a quiet place, carrying years of friendship like a weight they didn't know how to set down. When they parted, they hugged like they always did, but there was a subtle stiffness in it, a feeling that they were hugging a memory as much as a person. The months kept moving. He kept waking early. He kept choosing quiet mornings over loud nights. He didn't become famous. He didn't become rich overnight. His life didn't transform into some dramatic montage. It was slower than that. It was the slow stacking of small choices, the slow shaping of a man by the way he spent his time. Sometimes, on certain nights, he would feel the old pull, the urge to text the group and slide back into the booth like nothing changed. There were evenings when the loneliness pressed against his ribs and made him question himself. But then he would remember the sentence in the hallway. He would remember the way his closest friend had called his growth arrogance. He would remember how much energy he used to spend trying to prove he was still the same. And he would sit with the loneliness until it passed. One morning, driving to the gym while the city was still half asleep, he passed the old bar. It was closed. The sign outside was dark. The windows were black. The building looked small in the daylight, less magical, more ordinary. He slowed down without meaning to. He could picture the booth. He could picture their faces. He could hear the laughter. He could remember the feeling of belonging like it was a warmth on his skin. He also remembered the weight, the subtle heaviness he used to ignore, the way time would disappear there and leave him feeling foggy, the way he used to wake up the next day feeling like he had traded something without knowing the price. He kept driving. The road ahead was quiet. The sky was pale and open. He felt something in him settle again, not triumph, not victory, just acceptance. The kind of acceptance that doesn't feel good or bad, it just feels real. Later that week, his phone buzzed with a message from his closest friend. No long paragraph, no apology, no guilt trip. Just a photo. It was an old photo from years ago, the four of them sitting at that same table, arms around each other, smiles wide and careless. The lighting made them look younger than they were. The photo held a version of time that didn't exist anymore. Under it, the friend had typed 2 words. Crazy days. He stared at the message for a long time. His thumb hovered over the screen. He could have replied with a joke. He could have replied with something warm. He could have replied with anger. He could have replied with a speech about growth and misunderstanding. Instead, he let the photo sit there in his hands like something fragile. He typed slowly. "Yeah," he wrote. "Hope you good." He hit send and set the phone down. The room was quiet. Outside, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent and constant. He sat there for a while, letting the silence hold him, feeling the ache of what was lost without turning it into bitterness, feeling the relief of what he had gained without turning it into arrogance. Some friendships don't end with a fight. They end with a slow, quiet distance that neither person knows how to name. And sometimes the hardest part isn't leaving. It's realizing you didn't hate them at all.